Revenge with Karen.
You know that feeling when you're the drywall of an organization? You hold up the paint, you support the structure, you keep the wind out, but nobody ever looks at you and says, "Wow, nice sheetrock." That was me. I was the project director at Sterling Dynamics for 7 years. My job description was basically make sure the NEPA babies don't accidentally burn the building down while trying to use the copier. I fixed spreadsheets that were bleeding red ink, smoothed over client relationships that the sales bros destroyed with their hangover breath, and I stayed late enough that the cleaning crew knew my coffee order. But to the board, to the C-suite, I was furniture. Beige, silent, serviceable furniture. It was 3 weeks ago when the invitation dropped on my desk. Heavy cardstock, gold-foiled edges, smelling faintly of money and pretension. The annual Founders Gala. Usually, this event is reserved for the inner circle, the VPs, board members, and the shiny young things in marketing who spend more time curating their LinkedIn vibes than actually working. Getting an invite felt less like an honor and more like a clerical error, or worse, a pity summon. I stared at the embossed calligraphy, Rebecca Vance plus guest. My last name usually didn't trigger any alarms. Vance is common enough. Like Smith or Johnson, it's a name you can find in any phone book in the state. Nobody at Sterling Dynamics remembered that 40 years ago, the sign on the door didn't just say Sterling. It said Sterling and Vance. But history is written by the victors, and corporate history is written by the guys who own the shredders. My mother, Margaret Vance, had been erased from the company lore so thoroughly that I could walk past her old office every single day without anyone knowing I was the daughter of the woman who actually designed the flagship product. Going to the prom, Becky? The voice came from Chad, a junior VP of strategy whose primary strategy involved delegating his entire workload to me while he practiced his golf swing in the break room. He was leaning against my doorframe, wearing a suit that cost more than my car, looking at me like I was a golden retriever trying to do calculus. "It's a gala, Chad." And yes, I said, not looking up from my monitor. "I might stop by." "Cute," he smirked, sipping a green juice that looked like pond scum. "Try not to wear that gray blazer you love so much. The dress code is black tie, not DMV Employee of the Month." He laughed. I didn't. I just typed louder. That was the dynamic. They pushed, I absorbed. They took the credit, I took the antidepressants. But this time, looking at that heavy envelope, something in my gut twisted. It wasn't just frustration, it was a deep ancestral rage. I wasn't just going to go. I was going to show them exactly who was holding up the drywall. I went home that night to the small, meticulously clean apartment I shared with Daniel. Now, if you looked at Daniel, you wouldn't see a shark. You'd see a golden retriever in a sweater vest. He's soft-spoken, wears glasses that slide down his nose, and drives a Honda Civic that has survived 3 presidencies. To the untrained eye, he's the budget option. The safe choice, the boring accountant type. Daniel isn't an accountant. He's an estate lawyer, and not the kind that helps grandma write a will for her cats. He's the kind that specializes in legacy disputes and hostile trust reversions. He's the guy you call when you want to surgically remove a tumor from a family fortune without killing the patient. "They invited me," I said, tossing the envelope onto the kitchen island next to his stack of case files. Daniel looked up, pushing his glasses up his nose. Read the invitation, his eyes narrowing slightly behind the lenses. He knew the history. He knew about my mom. He knew that technically, if the paperwork from 1985 was ever dragged into the sunlight, I wasn't just an employee. "Are we going?" he asked, his voice calm, steady. "Chad told me not to wear my gray blazer," I said, pouring a glass of cheap Pinot Grigio. "He thinks I'm going to embarrass the department." Daniel smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who just found a loophole in a 50-page contract. "Well, we can't have that. I think it's time we introduce them to the rest of the family, don't you? Or at least, the accessories." He wasn't talking about earrings. He was talking about the watch. My mother had left me very little when she passed. Most of her equity had been stolen by the current CEO, Richard Sterling, decades ago. But she had left me one specific item, custom-commissioned Patek Philippe, engraved, one of one, gifted to her by the original founder, Richard's father, before the betrayal. It was a piece of horological history that screamed founder status to anyone who knew what they were looking at. And the current board chairman, Mr. Halston, he was a watch fanatic. I'd seen him drooling over vintage Rolexes in magazines during downtime. "You want to wear the watch?" I asked, feeling my heart rate spike. "I think it goes with my suit, Daniel deadpanned. And Rebecca, if we do this, we don't back down. This isn't just a party. It's a deposition with an open bar. I looked at him, my budget +1, and felt a surge of adrenaline that replaced the usual fatigue. Let's burn it down, I whispered, but quietly, with appetizers. Listen, before I tell you how I dismantled a billion-dollar company over a plate of rubber chicken, do me a solid. If you're enjoying the tea I'm about to spill, hit that follow button or upvote or whatever the kids do. I'm writing this between celebratory drinks, and seeing the numbers go up gives me the dopamine hit I used to get from fixing Chad's pivot tables. Okay, back to the carnage. The week leading up to the gala was excruciating. I had to play the role of the grateful drone. I nodded when they talked about corporate synergy. I smiled when Ava Sterling, CEO's daughter and current chief brand officer, a made-up job that mostly involved posting selfies, walked through the office criticizing the carpet color. Ava was the final boss of Karen's. She was 30, gorgeous in a terrifying, plastic way, and had never heard the word no in her life. She treated the company like her personal dollhouse. She once fired an intern for making eye contact with her while she was eating a salad. It was the one who had organized the gala. She was the one who decided who sat where. And when the seating chart was leaked, emailing the whole company by accident is a classic Chad move. I saw it. Table 42. The VIP tables were 1 through 10. The mid-level management was 11 through 30. Table 42 was practically in the kitchen. It was the table for the obligatory invites, the senior staff who weren't important enough to shine, but too tenured to fire. It was the table by the bathroom doors. Table 42, Daniel said later that night, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit that looked understated until you touched the fabric. Strategic, close to the exits. Good for a tactical withdrawal, or a tactical insertion, I muttered, putting on the dress I had bought. It wasn't trendy. It was a vintage black silk gown that belonged to my mother. It was timeless, elegant, severe. It didn't scream, look at me. It whispered, I belong here more than you do. I walked over to Daniel and fastened the watch onto his wrist. The heavy gold case gleamed under the hallway light. The face was complex, full of dials and complications that marked the phases of the moon and the leap years. It was heavy with history. Ready to be my budget +1? I asked, straightening his lapel. Daniel checked the time on the multi-million-dollar antique strapped to his wrist. Becca, he said, I've been preparing for this case since our second date. Let's go get your company back. We walked out to his Honda Civic. I knew that in a few hours, the world as Sterling Dynamics knew it was going to shift on its axis. But as we drove toward the downtown convention center, seeing the city lights blur, I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold, hard certainty of a woman who has receipts. They thought they invited a ghost to their party, didn't realize that ghosts are the only ones who know where the bodies are buried. The ballroom at the Grand Hyatt smelled like lilies and desperation. It was a cavernous space, draped in gold silk and uplighting, that was supposed to make everyone look 10 years younger, but mostly just made the shrimp cocktails look radioactive. The air was thick with the hum of 1,000 conversations, all of them centered around money, status, or who was sleeping with the VP of operations. As Daniel and I handed our coats to the check girl, I felt the familiar cloak of invisibility settle over me. We walked through the metal detectors, because nothing says celebration like security theater, and entered the fray. The room was divided like high school cafeteria on steroids. The center of the room was dominated by the golden circle, the tables surrounding the dance floor, where the board members and C-suite executives sat. That area had its own dedicated waiters, better wine, and an invisible force field of smugness. We navigated the periphery, dodging tray-wielding servers and middle managers trying to look important. Table 42 was exactly where I expected it to be, tucked behind a massive pillar, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. Every time a waiter burst out with a tray of filet mignon, we got a blast of steam and swearing. Charming, Daniel noted, pulling out my chair. Great acoustics for the dishwasher cycle. It's the legacy employee section, I said, gesturing to the other occupants of the table. There was Marge from accounting, who had been there since 1990 and was currently trying to fit 3 bread rolls into her purse. There was Ken from IT, who looked like he was attending a funeral. And there was me. We sat. I poured water. I kept my head down. But Daniel was observing, wasn't looking at the people at our table. He was scanning the room, his eyes tracking the movement of the power players. He watched how Richard Sterling, the CEO, patted men on the back with aggressive joviality. He watched Mr. Halston, the chairman, nursing a scotch and looking bored out of his mind. Then the atmosphere shifted. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Ava Sterling had arrived. She didn't just walk in, she invaded. She was flanked by her squad, 3 women who looked like clones of each other, all wearing dresses that cost more than my student loans. Ava was wearing a shimmering silver gown that looked like it was made of liquid diamonds. It was stunning, and she knew it. She moved through the crowd like a shark through a school of tuna, parting the sea of employees who were desperate for a nod, a smile, anything to validate their existence. She was heading toward the VIP section, but her path took her right past the pillar. Past table 42, she paused, not because she wanted to say hello, but because she saw me, or rather, she saw an opportunity to perform dominance. "Rebecca," she called out. Her voice was high, bright, and laced with arsenic. The conversation at the nearby tables died down. "I didn't think you'd actually come. We were taking bets in marketing." I stood up, smoothing the silk of my mother's dress. "Wouldn't miss it, Ava. It's the company's big night." Ava's eyes scanned me, looking for a loose thread, a stain, a brand she could mock. Finding nothing obviously wrong with the vintage black silk, she shifted her gaze to Daniel. Daniel was sitting, calm as a monk, sipping his water. He didn't stand up for her. That was his first sin in her book. "And who is this?" Ava asked, gesturing to him with a manicured hand as if he were a stray dog I'd brought inside. "I see we're branching out." "This is Daniel," I said, "my fiancé." Ava let out a laugh. It was a short, sharp sound, like glass breaking. She leaned in, loud enough for the surrounding 3 tables to hear. "Oh, sweetie, that's adorable. He's very sensible. I guess when you work in project management, you get used to budget cuts, right? Even in your dating life. Brought yourself a little budget plus one," her entourage giggled. Chad, who had materialized nearby, snorted into his drink. I felt the heat rise up my neck. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the feeling of a loaded gun's safety being clicked off. I opened my mouth to speak, to eviscerate her, but Daniel's hand gently touched my arm. He looked up at Ava. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He looked at her with the mild curiosity of a biologist examining a particularly noisy insect. "Budget plus one," Daniel repeated, testing the phrase. His voice was low, smooth, and carried surprisingly well. "I suppose that's one way to look at it. Efficiency is key in any enterprise, isn't it, Miss Sterling?" Ava blinked. She wasn't used to the furniture talking back. "Right? Well, try the chicken. I hear it's adequate." She spun on her heel, her silver dress swishing, and marched toward the VIP section, her laughter trailing behind her like exhaust fumes. The people at the nearby tables smirked at us, glad it wasn't them in the crosshairs. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly. "I'm going to kill her," I hissed. "I'm going to strangle her with her own extensions." Daniel picked up his fork. He looked unbothered. He looked focused. He adjusted his cuff, ensuring the heavy gold watch was slightly exposed, catching the overhead light. "Don't kill her, Rebecca," he said softly, buttering a roll. "That's illegal and messy. We're going to do something much worse." "What?" "We're going to let them notice us." He nodded toward the VIP section. Mr. Halston, the board chairman, turned in his seat. The commotion with Ava had drawn his eye. He was looking past the pillar. He was looking at our table. And for the first time in 20 years, the man who held the keys to the kingdom wasn't looking at the CEO's daughter. He was squinting, his brow furrowed, staring directly at Daniel's left wrist. The bait was in the water. "Eat your salad," Daniel said. "Showtime is in 10 minutes. The salad course was a wilted affair, iceberg lettuce drowning in a vinaigrette that tasted like battery acid. At table 42, the mood was somber. Marge was aggressively buttering her 3rd roll, and Ken from IT was checking crypto prices on his phone under the tablecloth. We were the island of misfit toys, ignored by the mainland of success happening 50 feet away. But I wasn't watching my salad. I was watching Mr. Halston. Arthur Halston was a legend in the industry. He was 70 years old, with hair like brushed steel and a face carved out of granite. He wasn't the CEO, Richard Sterling was the CEO, but Halston was the chairman of the board. He was the money. He was the history. He was the one who knew where all the skeletons were because he had paid for the shovels. And right now, he was ignoring the CEO's speech about Q3 synergies. He was staring at Daniel. Specifically, he was staring at Daniel's hand, which was resting casually on the white tablecloth. The Patek Philippe was gleaming. It wasn't a flashy watch. It didn't have diamonds. To a layman, it looked like an old, scratched gold watch. But to a collector, it was the holy grail. It was a 1978 custom complication, commissioned by the founder, Elias Sterling, for his partner. There was only one in existence. I saw Halston lean forward. He took off his reading glasses. He wiped them, put them back on, and stared again, whispered something to the person next to him, then shook his head. He stood up. The room was still buzzing with chatter. Nobody noticed the chairman walking away from the head table. He didn't walk with the swagger of the sales guys. He walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man who sees a ghost. "Don't look," I whispered to Daniel. "I'm not looking," Daniel said, taking a sip of water. "I'm admiring the floral arrangement." Halston navigated through the tables, bypassed the VPs. He bypassed the directors. He came straight to the shadowed corner by the kitchen doors. He stopped at our table. Marge froze, a bread roll halfway to her mouth. Ken dropped his phone. The air around us seemed to freeze. "Excuse me," Halston said. His voice was gravelly and authoritative. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Daniel. "I don't mean to interrupt your dinner, but that timepiece." Daniel looked up, feigning mild surprise. "The watch?" Halston asked, gesturing vaguely. It was a breach of etiquette, but Halston was the etiquette. Daniel extended his wrist. Halston leaned in close, his eyes widening. I saw his breath hitch. He recognized the engraving pattern on the bezel. He recognized the specific, unique font of the numerals. "Where did you get this?" Halston asked. The authority was gone from his voice, replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. This shouldn't exist. I was told this was lost in the chaotic transition of '85. Daniel smiled politely. "It wasn't lost, sir. It was gifted. It's a family heirloom." "Family?" Halston looked up, his eyes darting to Daniel's face, searching for a resemblance to the Sterling line. He wouldn't find one. "Not my family," Daniel said, turning his head slightly to gesture to me. "Hers." Halston turned to me. For the first time in 7 years of working at this company, Arthur Halston actually saw me, looked at my face, really looked at it. He traced the line of my jaw, the shape of my eyes. "I know you," he murmured. "You work in project management." "Rebecca Vance," I said clearly. I didn't shout, but in the sudden silence of our table, it sounded like a gunshot. "My name is Rebecca Vance." The color drained from Halston's face so fast I thought he was having a stroke. He gripped the back of Marge's chair to steady himself. "Vance," he whispered. "Margaret's daughter?" "Yes," I said. "Margaret Vance was my mother." Halston looked back at the head table, where Richard Sterling was laughing loudly at his own joke, oblivious to the sword hanging over his head. Then he looked back at me, and I saw something flash in his eyes. "Guilt, fear, calculation." "The watch," Halston said, his voice trembling. "It was Elias's gift to her, when she left the board." "She didn't leave the board, Mr. Halston," I said, my voice steady, channeling every ounce of rage I had suppressed for a decade. "She was erased, and she didn't lose the watch. She kept it, along with the original articles of incorporation." Halston stood up straight. The shock was hardening into something else. He was a businessman, first and foremost. He realized instantly that the narrative he had been fed for 30 years, that Margaret Vance had sold her shares and vanished, was a lie. And if the heir was sitting at table 42, wearing the proof. "Need to talk," Halston said. "Not here." "I'm enjoying my salad," I said, bluffing. "Rebecca," Halston said, and this time he used my name with respect. "Please, bring your fiancé, come to the founder's room." He turned and walked away, not waiting for an answer. I looked at Daniel. He adjusted his glasses. "Well," Daniel said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "I think we're done with the budget section of the evening." We stood up. As we walked away from table 42, following the chairman, I felt eyes on us. Ava was watching from the high table, a frown creasing her perfect forehead. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew that the furniture had just gotten up and walked out with the owner of the house. The game was on. The founder's room was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, soundproofed against the noise of the gala outside. It smelled of old cigars and secrets. Portraits of past executives lined the walls. There was Elias Sterling, founder, and next to him, a conspicuously empty space where a portrait had clearly been removed decades ago. A faded square on the wallpaper marked the spot where my mother should have been. Halston closed the heavy oak door and turned to us. He didn't offer us a drink. He looked like he needed one himself. "For 30 years, Halston began, pacing the Persian rug, Richard told the board that your mother accepted a cash buyout. He said she wanted out, said she was unstable, that she took the money and moved to Europe." "She moved to LA, I said coldly. "And she didn't take a buyout. She was forced out, locked out of the building. Her access codes revoked overnight. You were there, weren't you?" "I was a junior associate then," Halston defended himself, though he looked weary. I saw the paperwork, the transfer of shares. It looked legitimate. It was a shell transfer, Daniel interrupted. He had opened his briefcase. She had checked at the coat check, but retrieved on our way here. He pulled out a slender file folder. The shares were transferred to a holding company called Vance Future Trust. Richard told everyone that was an external buyer, but it wasn't. Daniel slid a document across the heavy table. It was a holding trust, Daniel continued, his lawyer voice slicing through the room, established by Margaret Vance. The terms were specific. The shares were not liquidized by the company within 10 years, or if the company failed to pay the agreed-upon dividends, which they never did, because Richard thought the trust was a dummy corp he controlled, the ownership reverts. Halston picked up the document. His hands were shaking. He put on his glasses and read. I watched his eyes dart back and forth. I saw the moment the realization hit him. This is an automatic reversion clause, Halston whispered. Triggered. Upon the death of the primary beneficiary. My mother passed away 6 months ago, I said, my voice catching slightly. That's when the clock started ticking. The trust dissolved. The assets didn't vanish, Mr. Halston. They reverted to the next of kin. Me, I added. Halston looked up. He looked at the document, then at me. He did the mental math. If this is valid, if these shares reverted, 48%, Daniel supplied the number. Margaret held 48% of the founding stock. Richard holds 30. The rest is public float. You own half the company, Halston breathed. The gravity of it seemed to crush him. You've been working in project management, filing expense reports, while owning half the building. I didn't know until we found the papers in her safety deposit box, I admitted. She never told me. She wanted to protect me. She knew Richard was ruthless. She waited until she was gone, till the reversion was legally unstoppable, to let the truth come out. I looked at the empty spot on the wall. She played the long game. She knew Richard's ego would prevent him from ever checking the details of the dummy trust he thought he buried her in. Halston sank into a leather chair. He looked old. Richard is going to destroy you. He has lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. I am a lawyer, Daniel said pleasantly, and I don't eat breakfast. It slows me down. Daniel pulled out another document. We filed the reversion claim with the Secretary of State this morning. It's already in the system. Technically, as of 9:00 a.m. today, Rebecca is the majority shareholder. We just came tonight to inform the board. Halston laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. You came to the gala to fire the CEO? We came to enjoy the dinner, I said, my courage hardening into steel. Since the chicken was dry and his daughter insulted my fiancé. Yes, I think a change in management is due. Halston looked at me. For a moment, I thought he would call security. I thought he would have us thrown out. But Arthur Halston didn't get to be chairman by backing the losing horse. He looked at the document. He looked at the watch on Daniel's wrist, the undeniable proof of Elias Sterling's favor. Richard has been running this company into the ground, Halston muttered almost to himself. The stock is stagnant. The innovation is dead. He's listening to his daughter, who thinks branding is more important than engineering. He looked up at me. If I back you, Halston said, what happens to the board? The board stays, I said. But Richard goes, and Ava goes, and my mother's portrait goes back on the wall. Halston was silent for a long moment. Then he stood up and straightened his tie. The CEO is about to give his keynote speech, Halston said. I suggest we go back out there. It would be a shame if he toasted a future he no longer controls. After you, Daniel said. Walking back into the ballroom felt like re-entering the atmosphere. The noise hit us instantly, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of hundreds of people pretending to like each other, the soft jazz band playing a neutered version of a pop song. But this time, we didn't head for table 42. Halston led the way, walked with a new energy, a grim determination. He didn't guide us to the shadows. He walked us right up to the edge of the VIP section. Wait here, Halston murmured. Watch the phones. He moved toward his seat at the head table. I stood there, clutching Daniel's arm. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Breathe, Daniel whispered. You're not the project manager anymore. You're the owner. I feel like I'm going to throw up, I confessed. Don't. Stained silk. At the head table, Richard Sterling was holding court. He was a large man, red-faced from too much scotch and too much shouting. Ava was next to him, laughing loudly at something a younger board member said. She looked up and saw us standing near the VIP perimeter. She frowned, confused. She waved a hand, shooing us away, like we were stray cats who had wandered back onto the porch. She mouthed something that looked like go away. I didn't move. I just stared at her. Then it started. It began with the general counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Jessica sitting 2 seats down from Richard. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, frowned, and picked it up. Her eyes widened. She swiped, tapped, and read. Her face went pale. She looked up, scanning the room frantically until her eyes locked on Halston, who was just sitting down. Then the CFO's phone buzzed. Then the VP of Operations. It was a domino effect of digital panic. The email Daniel had time to release was hitting the internal board server. Subject, urgent, shareholder reversion notice and asset freeze. I watched the ripple spread. One by one, the suits at the head table stopped eating. They stopped laughing. They picked up their devices. The color drained from the faces of the men who had spent years ignoring me in the hallway. Whispers started. Is this real? Who is Vance Future Trust? Look at the attachment. Ava, oblivious, was trying to get the attention of the table. Daddy, tell them the story about the yacht, she squealed. Richard, however, wasn't listening. Jessica, the general counsel, had leaned over and shoved her phone in his face. Richard, she hissed, you need to see this. Not now, Jess, I'm celebrating, Richard boomed. Richard, read it, now. The tone of her voice cut through the alcohol haze. Richard grabbed the phone. He squinted at the screen. I saw his jaw clench. The red in his face deepened to a dangerous purple. He stood up. Who sent this? Is this a joke? Which one of you idiots got hacked? His voice carried over the jazz band. The room went quiet. People at the lower tables turned around. It's not a hack, Richard, Halston said calmly from his seat. He hadn't touched his phone. He was cutting his steak. It says here that Margaret's shares have reverted, Richard sputtered, spittle flying. Margaret is dead. Bought her out? This is fraud. It's a filing from the Secretary of State, Jessica said, her voice trembling. It's certified, Richard, the trust. It was never dissolved. Who is doing this? Richard roared, looking around the room like a wounded bull. Who is behind this? Halston put down his knife and fork. He wiped his mouth. He turned his chair slowly. I believe, Halston said, his voice projecting to the back of the silent room, the majority shareholder is standing right there. Pointed, not a lawyer, not a bank representative. He pointed at me, Rebecca, the woman in the vintage dress, the woman who had been told to sit by the kitchen. Richard's eyes followed the finger. Ava's eyes followed. 300 pairs of eyes turned to look at the budget plus one couple standing at the edge of the dance floor. Ava stood up, her lip curling. Her? The project manager? Daddy, she's nobody. She's bringing her weird boyfriend to crash the party. Kick her out. I stepped forward. The fear was gone. The nausea was gone. All that was left was the ice. I'm not crashing, Ava, I said, my voice clear in the silence. I'm inspecting the assets. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. You could hear the hum of the HVAC system, which, ironically, I had scheduled for maintenance next week. Guess that's someone else's problem now. Richard Sterling stumbled away from the table, marching toward me. He was a big man, used to using his physical size to intimidate subordinates. But he stopped 5 feet away when Daniel stepped slightly in front of me. It wasn't an aggressive move, just a subtle shifting of geometry. A wall had been placed. Rebecca, Richard barked, trying to regain the persona of the benevolent but stern boss. I don't know what kind of prank you and your friend are pulling, but this is a career-ending move. Forging corporate documents, that's prison time. It would be, Daniel said, his voice conversational if they were forged. But as your general counsel can verify, the notary stamp is from 1985, and the reversion filing is timestamped today. Would you like the case number? Jessica, the general counsel, was tapping furiously on her tablet. Richard, she said, her voice high and tight. I'm looking at the county clerk's database. It's there. The Vance Future Trust is active. The reversion clause is airtight. It can't be. Ava shrieked. She had come down from the dais to stand beside her father, looking like a prom queen whose crown had just been stolen. My grandfather built this company. We own it. She's just some admin girl. Your grandfather, I said, looking at Ava, built this company with my mother. They were partners. 50-50. Until your father manipulated the board into pushing her out when she got sick. She was weak. Richard yelled. She couldn't handle the pressure. I saved the company. You stole the company. I corrected him. You moved her assets into a trust you thought you controlled, hoping she'd die quietly so you could absorb the shares. But you got greedy, Richard. You never liquidated the trust because you didn't want to pay the taxes on the transfer. You left it dormant. And because you left it dormant, the original bylaws applied. I took a step closer. Clause 14, Section B, I recited. The event of the beneficiary's death without prior liquidation, all assets revert to the direct heir. Immediate vesting. Richard looked at Jessica. She nodded slowly. She looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. So, I said, looking around the room at the stunned faces of my colleagues. Technically, Richard, you work for me, and I have some concerns about your performance. A gasp rippled through the room. Chad, standing near the bar, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Can't do this, Richard hissed, sweat beading on his forehead. I am the CEO. The board supports me. Do they? Daniel asked. He looked at Halston. Halston remained seated, swirling his scotch. He looked at Richard. The bylaws are clear, Richard. If she holds 48% and I hold 5%, and the public float is scattered, she controls the vote. She can call a no-confidence motion right now. I have 30%. Richard screamed. 30 is less than 53. Ken from IT shouted from table 42. God bless you, Ken. Ava stepped forward, her face twisted in ugly rage. You little witch. You think you can walk in here in your thrift store dress and take my legacy? It's not a thrift store dress, Ava, I said softly. It's a vintage Dior. My mother wore it to the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the first factory. The factory you tried to sell last year to buy a private jet. She's lying. Ava screamed, looking around for support. Security, get them out. 2 security guards in blazers started to move forward, looking unsure. Daniel raised his hand. He didn't look at the guards. He looked at Jessica. Jessica, Daniel said, as the acting legal representative for the majority shareholder, I am informing you that any employee who physically obstructs the majority owner will be terminated for cause immediately and sued for assault. Jessica stood up. Stand down, she ordered the guards. Her voice cracked, but the order was clear. The guards stopped. Ava stomped her foot, actually stomped it. Jessica, do your job. I am, Jessica said, looking at her tablet. I'm protecting the company from liability, and right now, Miss Vance is the company. Richard looked at his daughter, then at his lawyer, then at me. The realization was finally sinking in. The walls were closing. We can settle this, Richard said, voice dropping to a desperate whisper. Rebecca, look. We can work something out, a raise, a promotion, VP of, whatever you want. Just rescind the filing, a raise, I laughed. Richard, you missed the window for a raise about 5 years ago. I don't want a promotion. I want my mother's name back. The doors to the ballroom burst open. It wasn't a guest. It wasn't a waiter. It was a procession of 4 people in dark suits carrying briefcases. They didn't look like partygoers. They looked like undertakers for a funeral that hadn't been scheduled yet. Who are they? Ava demanded, her voice shrill. That, Daniel said, checking his watch, would be the process servers. Right on time. The lead suit walked straight up to Richard Sterling. The music had stopped completely. The only sound was the heavy footsteps on the parquet floor. Richard Sterling, the man asked. What now? Richard groaned. You are served, the man said, shoving a thick stack of papers into Richard's chest. He turned to Ava. Ava Sterling, you are also served. Served with what? Ava screeched, not taking the papers. They fell to the floor at her feet. Temporary restraining order and asset freeze, Daniel explained helpfully. Pending a forensic audit of company finances. We have reason to believe that company funds, specifically from the R&D budget, have been misappropriated for personal use. The yacht, branding trips to Cabo. The courts found the evidence. Compelling. Richard turned purple. You audited me? How? I didn't, I said. You did. You made me manage the budget, remember? You made me fix the spreadsheets. You made me hide the miscellaneous expenses in the project codes. I saw every dollar you stole, Richard. I just kept copies. The room gasped. This was the kill shot. It wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about embezzlement. She's bluffing. Richard yelled, looking at the board members. It's a lie, is it? I asked. Check page 42 of the injunction. It lists the wire transfers to Sterling Lifestyle LLC. I believe Marge in accounting can verify those routing numbers. Marge, I turned to table 42. Marge, who had been terrified 10 minutes ago, was now standing up. She looked at Richard, the man who had denied her a cost of living adjustment for 3 years. Yes, Marge said, voice shaking but clear. I recognized the routing numbers, I thought. I thought they were authorized vendors, but they went to a Cayman account. Richard looked at Marge like she had stabbed him. The betrayal of the little people. Ava looked at her father. Daddy, what does that mean? It means, Halston interjected, standing up fully now that the board is calling an emergency session. Immediately, you can't do this without me. Richard shouted. Actually, Halston said, looking at me, the majority shareholder moves for an immediate suspension of the CEO pending investigation. We have to comply. Halston looked at me. The question was in his eyes. Do it. I moved to suspend Richard Sterling and Ava Sterling, effective immediately, I said. and I move to bar them from the premises until the audit is complete. Seconded, Halston said instantly. Thirded, said the VP of Operations, who had clearly just decided which way the wind was blowing. Fourth, said Jessica, the general counsel. Richard looked around. His empire was dissolving in real time. His allies were jumping ship. He looked at me, his eyes full of hate. You're nothing, he spat. You're a glorified secretary. And you, I said, are trespassing. Richard stood there, panting, a king without a crown. But Ava wasn't done. She was a creature of image, and she couldn't handle the public humiliation. She grabbed the microphone from the stunned band leader's stand. Listen to me, she screamed, the feedback screeching through the speakers. This is insane. You're going to trust her. Look at her. She's wearing a rag. She drives a sedan. She's just jealous because she's a loser who could never be us. She pointed a manicured finger at me. And that watch, it's probably fake. Just like her claim. My grandfather wouldn't have given a priceless heirloom to her mother. Her mother was a nobody. The room was silent. Ava's screeching hung in the air like a bad smell. I walked over to Daniel. Give me the watch, I whispered. He unclasped it and handed it to me. It was warm from his skin, heavy. I walked up to the dais. I didn't grab the mic from Ava, I just stood next to her. She looked at me with wild, teary eyes. You want to see the watch, Ava? I asked. I held it up. I turned it over. Mr. Halston, I said. Would you read the inscription on the back for the room? Halston stepped forward. He took the watch reverently, adjusted his glasses. He leaned into the microphone Ava was still clutching. It says, Halston read, his voice deep and resonant. To Margaret, my partner, my conscience. The true genius behind the engine, Elias. A murmur went through the crowd. The true genius. Your grandfather knew who built this company, I said to Ava, my voice calm but projecting. He knew it wasn't him, it was Margaret. He handled the money. She handled the physics. He designed the propulsion drive that made you rich, Ava. She designed the patents that paid for your dress. And you treated her daughter like a servant. I turned to the screen behind the stage, which had been playing a loop of the company logo. Daniel, I said, play the clip. Daniel, who had connected his phone to the AV system while everyone was watching the argument, never underestimate a nerd with a dongle, hit play. The screen flickered. Grainy video from 1982 appeared. It was an interview with Elias Sterling, Richard's father. He looked young, vibrant. Interviewer, Mr. Sterling, the new turbine is revolutionary. How did you come up with the intake design? Elias on screen laughs me, no. I can barely change a tire. That was Mags, Margaret Vance. She's the wizard. I just sell the tickets. Without her, this company is just a warehouse full of scrap metal. Video froze on Elias's smiling face. I looked at Richard. You buried that interview. You scrubbed it from the archives, but my mother kept a VHS copy. I turned back to the room. For 30 years, you've been told that the Sterling standard meant excellence, I said. But the Sterling who runs this place now, I pointed at Richard, is a fraud. He erased the woman who built the tech, and then he spent the profits on himself. The company isn't broke because of the market. It's broke because he looted it. I looked at the employees at table 42, at the sales guys, at the marketing team. I'm not here to destroy the company, I said. I'm here to give it back to the people who actually do the work. Because unlike them, I gestured to Richard and Ava, I know what it's like to fix the leaks. The applause started slowly. It was Marge, then Ken, then the entire back half of the room, then the managers. Then, finally, the board members. The writing on the wall joined in. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar. It was the sound of 100 frustrated employees seeing the tyrant fall. Ava dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a thud. She looked small, defeated. Get out, I said to her, and leave the company credit card. Security escorted Richard and Ava out the side door. Richard was threatening to sue everyone from the Supreme Court to God himself. Ava was crying, trying to text her influencer friends, but someone, probably Jessica, had already remotely bricked her company phone. The gala didn't exactly continue, but it didn't end either. It transformed. The tension broke. The invisible barriers between the VIP section and the rest of the room dissolved. People from table 30 wandered up to the front. The expensive wine was opened for everyone. Halston pulled out a chair at the head table, Richard's chair. He looked at me. Miss Vance, he said, please. I sat down. The chair was comfortable. It felt right. Daniel pulled up a chair next to me. He poured me a glass of the vintage Cabernet that had been reserved for the CEO. Well, Daniel said, clinking his glass against mine. That went better than the rehearsal. I think Marge is going to name her firstborn after you, I observed. Marge was currently high-fiving the VP of HR. She'd better, Daniel said. I'm going to need her help with the audit. It's going to be a bloodbath, Rebecca. Richard's finances are a disaster. We're going to be in court for years. I know, I said, taking a sip of the wine. It tasted like victory, but we have the watch, and we have the building. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, press releases, and forensic accountants. The story broke in the Wall Street Journal, The Invisible Heiress, how a project manager reclaimed a dynasty. Stock actually jumped 15% on the news that Richard the Leech Sterling was out. I moved into the corner office. The first thing I did was take down the portrait of Richard. The second thing I did was hang the portrait of my mother, Margaret Vance, back in its rightful place in the lobby. I didn't fire everyone. I kept Chad, actually. I demoted him to junior associate and made him report to Ken. Watching him try to explain to Ken why he couldn't convert a PDF was the best entertainment money could buy. Ava tried to launch a podcast about toxic workplaces. It has 12 listeners. 7 of them are hate listening. As for Daniel, he's not my budget plus one anymore. He's the chief legal officer and my husband. We got married at the courthouse. No gala, just us, the watch, and a really good bottle of champagne. Sometimes, late at night, when the office is quiet, I walk past the boardroom. I look at the empty chair where Richard used to sit. I think about all the years I spent being invisible. I think about the gray blazer. I think about the people who look right through you because they think you don't matter. They forgot the most important rule of construction. The foundation is always buried, but if you mess with it, the whole house comes down. I'm Rebecca Vance. I own this place, and we're finally open for business. You're the real stars of the corporate jungle. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe, or I'll flick the switch on your old cubicle memories.